because someone really sucked at their job in 1969, we got 43,000 more 1969 Camaros. Back in 1969, they had a die manufacturer who took on the job of designing a big rear quarter panel die for this new Camaro. He wasn't very good at his job. And so what happened was when they went to stamp the die, the quarter panel just wrinkled something fierce. And if you take a look at the long rear quarter panel on the second-gen Camaros, because they were trying to go for a European styling.
Which I heard somebody say that, but you'll have to point those out to me.
Well, what you want to do is look at we'll get to that in a second. Sorry, Tony gets me sidetracked really easy. I'm a very simple person. So they said, okay, we've got 2 or 3 months and we've got to fix this die or we're in big trouble. So they spent 3 months redesigning the die, and it ended up even worse. So now the car, there's no way that they can manufacture this car. It's not going to make the launch time because they try to launch these things in late summer, early fall, and it's not even going to be ready. So they kept making 69 Camaros. So they made like, I got the number, 42,803 more 69 Camaros, which, I mean, there's 69 Camaros everywhere, and that's because this person didn't do their job properly, or this company didn't. So February of '70 rolls around and they say, hey, okay, we're ready for these cars. And they were selling like crazy. Fantastic cars. And now we get to the styling of it. People saw this car and they just freaked out because you went from a real small first-gen design to this big, long, swoopy car. And if you take a look at the grille on the 71s, 71s, they had that whole Maserati type look to them.
Large grille, just open.
Exactly. Yeah, and it was really attractive. And that's why people say that this version of the Camaro is the most attractive version Camaro that's ever been built. And to me, it is.
I
love the car. I mean, it's got a lot of cool stuff. The little bumperettes, which obviously are now illegal because they wouldn't hit the the minimum standards on it. But there's a lot of really cool stuff on the car. You know, they went to the door handles that didn't have the push buttons anymore. They had that pop-up rocker lift, and no more quarter windows, and obviously the triangle astro ventilation has gone away. So they were really smoothing the car out. And it was real attractive moves. I was 16 and there was one for sale in my neighborhood. Well, I was actually 15 when I bought it, and it was one for sale in my neighborhood, and I said, wow, that's just the most beautiful car that I had ever seen. So I bought it at 15 years old and rolled it in the barn like the Dukes of Hazzard. You know, it was all a piece of junk back then because it was 1980. So, you know, cars are, by 9 years, pretty much all of General Motors and Ford and Chrysler's cars that they were building back then, they were basically just shopping cart material. I mean, it was just the awful manufacturing process. They would rust out so bad. So by 10 years old, they needed a complete rebuild, redesign. So that's what I did, and rolled it out to school, and you're showing up in this car that was just the craziest, coolest car that I'd ever seen.
It's
really
neat, yeah.
Really stunning car.
I definitely do like the, of course, more expensive versions, but the RS and the SS that came with the bumperettes.
Yes.
Because the base models, I think, had that bumper that went all the way across it, and it just really breaks it up and doesn't look as mean or as Camaro as it should.
It's tough because when you describe a car as, well, it's not as ugly as I thought it was going to be. Whoever designed the bumperettes, more than likely the one-piece bumper came later, and the designer said, oh my God, I can't believe you're going to ruin my whole front end by installing that one-piece bumper on there. Because they did that with the Lamborghinis. Remember the Lamborghini came through, and then it had to have that big giant bumper put on the front that just ruined the car.
Well, the Veyron's like that too with the rear bumper.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Or is it Chiron's like that?
Yeah. When you make design changes like that to meet changes that are required in vehicles, you almost know that, like, the designer of the bumperette said, oh man, you're going to totally ruin my car. And I don't think they did, because when I see, and I love the split bumper cars, they're my favorite cars of all time, but when you see the full piece one bumper cars, I almost always think of the big block versions, because there was something intimidating about the fact that you had a big block back in the 70s, 80s when we were running around, because nobody had, big blocks were pretty rare in our area.
That time frame,
yeah. Pretty tough car to beat. So when that showed up, so almost all the full bumper cars were intimidating because you knew it was stronger, it was tougher, it was meaner, it was probably going to kick your butt. Man, I'm thirsty. I need a drink.
Cue the whiskey, girl.
So what I thought was interesting with this is that in the early 70s, so 70, 71, it actually came with a 396, but they said that was a 402 cubic inch motor that was in there, but they,
boarded out 30,000s.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, they had to bore the 396. But the biggest problem was in 71, we had the big emissions crunch come in. And then all the high compression ratios had to disappear. So that crushed the fact of the big blocks, because nobody wanted the big blocks anymore, because before the 396 was the 350 horse version, and then they knocked the heck out of the compression ratio, which if you've ever listened to an engine run with some really good compression in it, it's got this killer crack, this killer sound. Then as you lower the compression ratio down lower and lower, that crack goes away. And then pretty soon they just sound like every 70s car ever built.
I mean, the 80s too, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. And the 80s and when it continued on. And then that's why you listen to cars these days, like my 458's a high compression engine. It's got a killer sound to it. But they lost that. So people are like, why am I buying the big block engine? It's not making any horsepower anyways.
Right.
So you might as well, why are you hauling the weight? Buy the small blocks. Because they had, the engine that I had was the 350, 270 horse version. Real good, fast revving, nice engine for what it was. Obviously, I built it up later on because it was not enough for me. But at the same time, it would probably beat the big block, because the big block made a little bit more torque, but it was about the same horsepower, and the car was a lot heavier.
Yeah. And neat too that the one that was in the Super Sport was actually the same motor that was in the Corvette that year.
Oh, I didn't know it was exactly the same.
Same power.
Same power rating?
That's what they're saying.
It was interesting that, actually, I think I've got a section that we're going to bring up in a second. I'm going to hold up. I got a little surprise for you. And I love little surprises. But this car was still available with a 410 rear gear and the M22 Rock Crusher transmission. Now, if you know anything about the Muncie transmissions, they had the M21, which had a little bit different ratio for overall, but they had the M22, which was a really crazy drag racing type of a transmission, road racing type of a transmission, but it was called the Rock Crusher because of the angle of the gears and the layout in it made a lot of noise. That's why they called it the Rock Crusher, because it sounded like you're crushing rocks.
I didn't know that.
But the M22 was a really super tough transmission. You combine that with a 410 gear, and in just about any of the engines that you could put together in this combination, if you put some slicks on it, got a good launch capability, and put these in what was called stock class racing, you could get these things into the 12, 13 second range all day long, which is a really good accomplishment for the power level that they were in. Do you hear an alarm going off? I promised you a surprise, and I love these old ads and if you ever get a chance to just peruse the internet, you can see old ads like this of just all of the cool stuff that they were talking about. And this is a real treat for me. I read these things from start to finish. And this ad, they actually talk about the fact that this Camaro was supposed to be as good or better than the Corvette.
Right, which they said that what we were just talking about, the LT1 motor that came in the Z28 was the same one in the Corvette. So that's funny that they actually advertised it.
It's odd, you're right, because you're right. They almost always detune the one versus the other. Now, I know that they had in 70, they had a 370 horse, but I think they kicked it back. It was really basically the same engine, same exact engine. Could you have imagined back then if, like in 1970, they came out with a ZL1 Camaro, because they had the ZL1 Corvettes.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And that would be really, really cool to have those big engines in those. And there was a lot of manufacturers like Motion Baldwin and Nicky that did these Camaros and built them all up, and they promised 11 second quarter miles with them.
Wow.
Yeah, they did. Those were really big numbers back then.
Yeah, for sure.
And if you wonder, back then also there was a Ford dealer that had been sick of all these claims with the Baldwin Motion and Nicky guys, so he had a Boss Mustang that he said would take on any comers, and I think he put up like $2,000 for anybody that thought he could beat that car. And they had to be on the same layout. Well, what his trick was he had some special tires made for the car that were super sticky, because back then tire technology was really terrible. They were really hard rubber. He had some super sticky street tires made, so that was his big advantage with that car. And that's one of the problems with these cars, is that they're a great car on a street tire, but you can't put a slick on this car and not wad the thing up. because they're a unibody construction. So if you ever are walking by one of these cars and you see those little dents up by the rear quarter panel as it wings down, you better get subframe connectors on it, because they're still a unibody, and after a while, the doors won't open right. I mean, you're going to mess this car up.
Sure.
Yeah, they're not
Tube
built.
chassis time.
When they designed this car, they used technology that they had learned from the first generation for all the suspension design and pickup points and things, and made those changes for the Trans Am series.
Yeah, it's basically a brand new car, they said, from the first gen.
Absolutely. So it was all from technology that they picked up from the Penske racing operation and those guys. So they were all really learning about suspension at that time, saying, oh wow, this needs to be this camber curve, etc. So they translated all that stuff into this car. So it was a really fantastic car. As a matter of fact, I had one of these, and I could do over 150 miles an hour with this car, and it was like a Cadillac just floating down the road.
It's a big car.
But I will give you a really good tip. If you got a state cop chasing you and you're doing 150 miles an hour and you fly off the road, you can end up like this.
Don't do that.
Yeah, don't do that. That really hurt. But don't worry, I walked away from it.
He's still here.
I'm still here. Everything's okay. Yeah, a little bit of duct tape and some baling wire, and I'm back in business. This car is probably one of those cars that, oddly enough, they never hit big digit value. They never were six-digit cars. But there's 69 Camaros, lots of them, honestly, the 69 Camaro isn't a better car. I think it's a really, really attractive car as far as the styling goes in that area. I think the front end of this 71 Rally Sport SSZ28 combination is the most attractive front end. But
I agree.
It never had, I think the thing that killed this is it didn't ever have a real engine that went in it.
That's the thing, too. And I heard that back in the day that it was 454s were actually on the sheets, but they never went into production.
Oh, I didn't know that, because
So
I had seen, crazy. I used to work at a parts department, and I had seen 454 aluminum head part numbers in a book for 1970 and 71 that was slated for the Camaros. And I looked at that and I said, wow, these are like real part numbers. So you're right. They did exist, but you're right. They never put it together. Yeah. And the Baldwin Motion cars will draw that kind of money because they were converted into the higher powered engines.
Okay.
And these never got a factory engine, so the factory cars will never draw that big money.
And I think that's another thing, too, to bring up. Unfortunately, that when these cars started hitting, that's right around the time where, like, you had the declining interest in the pony cars, as you would say, of the higher interest rates, the emission issues that were happening. They're even talking about canceling the Camaro after the 72. Even thinking about it.
Well, and it's odd because these cars were, I mean, most cars built in the 70s were so unreliable that you wanted to keep a bus schedule in the glove box. I mean, they were just terrible. But these cars were extremely reliable, and to find one with 80,000, 100,000 miles on the road back then that was still running, they'd start blowing a little smoke about 100,000 miles or so. But just a quick rebuild, and it was really affordable, and you're back in business. And like the Oldsmobiles of the era, it wasn't uncommon to see 150,000 miles out of an Oldsmobile from the mid-70s. The Olds Cutlasses and stuff, super reliable. GM was really getting their program down, and all the same parts that are on this Camaro are on that Oldsmobile, the same type of rear end and brakes and layout. So they were really getting to be super reliable cars and really affordable when you compare them to the European counterparts. I mean, you take a Jaguar, for example. I mean, honestly, if you had a Jaguar back then and you weren't a wiring expert, you were going to walk home. Because those cars,
they were
just, oh my God, yeah. All of those European cars with all that, the way that they were laid out, they weren't really reliable, and they were double the money.
Yeah, they were. I mean, they crazy numbers back then.
Absolutely. All right, I think it's time. I hear a squealing noise. Now, I have a soft spot in my heart for this car because it was my very first car that I ever bought as a 15-year-old kid. And so my styling is going to be a little biased, but I don't think it's going to be as bad as you think it is. Because I still understand that you have to look at something and how it evolves and how time changes. And I think that still when this version comes rolling in the parking lot, everyone still looks at it. They don't look beyond it. I mean, because there are some cars that when they roll into the car show, you go, oh, you know, I've seen 4,000 of those before. It's not going to impress me. But there's something about these split bumper cars that people still look at them really good, especially if they're the right color. I mean, these cars in black are just, oh my God, just a really
even
beautiful
that green
car.
color that was unique that year.
Yeah, that was neat. But I think that the darker that you got with this body, the more sinister it looked.
Oh,
and I think that's the thing about this design, is that it is European, but it's still sinister. And that's why I gave it a 55.
Okay, all right, that's not bad.
I felt ballpark with you. Okay, I was worried about you.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
I was, because I will admit this isn't my favorite generation of Camaro. And funny enough, my first car was actually a Camaro, but it was a 2000. So I do have a sweet spot for GM products and Camaros, but this wasn't one of my favorites. So I thought I was being hard on it when I was giving my styling number. I do agree with you. The bumperettes, I like that version of it better. It is sinister looking if it's done right. But of course, me growing up, a lot of these cars that I would see were just, like you said, rolled in a barn or sitting out in someone's yard. They were never done properly. I never really saw good, complete versions of it.
Most of these cars, when you got people would modify them themselves, they were so ugly that you could just leave the keys in them and nobody's going to steal them.
Right.
I mean, they were just god awful. You know, you've all been to AutoZone and you've all seen all them stick-ons and stuff. They were on almost every Camaro ever built that lived long enough to get 10 years old, got sold to a kid in high school, bought all those stickers and stuck them on his car and all those crazy things. And oh my God. Yeah, so Camaros were definitely a victim of the whole aftermarket stick-ons.
Yeah,
so,
it was.
Yeah.
It was that generation from like the mid-70s, like in through the 80s that happened. Anyway, so I actually gave it a little bit higher score than you. I gave it a 55 because I was trying to be nice, and I felt bad giving it a lower score because it was your car.
Well, actually, Tony, you're drinking more than you thought because I'm at 55 as well.
Oh, okay. Well, great.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a long day. But in performance, you can't give this a big number.
No, you can't.
Yeah, they were all pretty awful. You know, the 70s were pretty decent. They had the 1970 version. They had the Z28, which was still 360 horse, and they had the big block, which was a decent 396-ish engine. You know, the big block, but it was detuned. I mean, it wasn't the big block wasn't as mean as it could have been.
It was getting hit hard. It wasn't. It didn't give it a chance. They didn't have a. It didn't have a chance. Is what it happened.
It didn't. And honestly, if they really wanted to get serious with this car, you know, I mean, if they wanted to use European styling, you know, let's put an independent rear suspension on this car.
Oh, that's true.
Because that would be
still had leaf springs, right?
Yeah, it's still a leaf spring car, but you know, even Chevrolet kept their leaf springs in the Corvette. They just turned them sideways. So, you know, tricky move, but it worked.
Smart.
And as a matter of fact, they were messing around with an independent rear suspension version of the F-body back when I worked at the dealership. They took it into the local racetrack at Grattan, and it was supposed to be a secret. And fuel pump went out on the car. Well, it was a one-off independent rear suspension F-body car. If you could find that out there, I bet it's worth a mint. But it exists because I saw it.
Don't tell them that. We got to find it.
I know it. And they couldn't get to the fuel pump. They brought it to our dealership to fix it. Couldn't get the fuel pump because all this independent rear suspension was underneath the car. And I was like, whoa. I said, what's going on with all this? Because I was a racer. I knew. And the guy goes, who are you? And I said, well, I just wanted to see all this. And you need to get out of here right now because I was just a younger kid then. And I wasn't supposed to be seeing this stuff. So if you look around somewhere out there, there's an F-body car that has independent rear suspension on it. This is about 89, 1990, right in that era. So they
Probably
knew.
in a museum somewhere.
They knew this car needed that, and it was on there. And if they would have put it on this car, then you'd really go after the Europeans with this, because this car did go over into Australia and race some of those series over there and do really well.
Trans Am racing.
Absolutely, and it did pretty well in Trans Am as well. So, but in performance, it's still, I knew where they were going with it, but they didn't get there, so I gave it a 35.
Wow, I am still surprised that you were below my number.
Really?
Interesting. I gave it a 40 for performance.
Okay,
again,
so
I felt
still not anything off in left field. But
I don't like talking bad about my friends' cars.
You're definitely going to give it a little bit of bias. I understand that. As a matter of fact, I will say that in this vehicle, I know that the rating is really low, but it's a really inexpensive car. It wasn't crazy money. So you almost have to use a dollar sign involved with that, because the European cars were twice the money, and I'll bet the number was almost exactly the same. Styling-wise, 55, performance-wise, 35. The Jaguars weren't high horsepowered engines back then, so it ran right with the Europeans, so you nailed it. Great job, Chevrolet. You got a toast on this one. Well, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and you know what they say, if you have an opinion that's different than ours, keep it to yourself.